My name is Maya Okafor. I am 38 years old. I have a law degree from Yale. I run a legal aid non-profit that has served over 12,000 clients in the last 6 years, and I live alone in a small house in Atlanta that I bought with money I earned myself. 8 years ago, my family sat me down in my parents' living room in Houston and told me that I was making a mistake with my life, that I was throwing away my potential, that the man I had chosen to love was wrong for me in ways I needed to understand before it was too late, and that if I walked out of that house and continued down the path I had chosen, I would be doing it without them. I walked out of that house. I continued down the path I had chosen. And what happened over the 8 years that followed, the building, the losing, the rebuilding, and the single evening that changed everything, is what I want to tell you about. This is not a story about proving people wrong, because I have learned that proving people wrong is a hollow objective that leaves you empty even when you achieve it. This is a story about what happens when you stop building your life for an audience and start building it for real. It is a story about a family that loved me imperfectly, and a man I loved perfectly and lost anyway, and about what I built in the rubble of both of those things. It is the most honest story I have. I hope it means something to you. My parents are Nigerian immigrants who came to the United States in 1981 with $300, 2 suitcases, and a belief in education so complete it was almost religious. My father, Emmanuel, became a chemical engineer. My mother, Adaise, became a pharmacist. They worked with a discipline I genuinely admire, and they built a life in Houston that was stable and warm and full of love. And they raised me and my 2 younger brothers with an expectation of achievement that was both their greatest gift to me and, at certain moments, the thing that came closest to breaking me. The expectation was not cruel. It was not even unreasonable, given where they had come from and what they had sacrificed to be where they were. But expectation, when it operates at a high enough temperature for a long enough time, can calcify into something that stops being about the person it claims to be for, and starts being about the expectations themselves. By the time I was in law school, my parents had a plan for my life that was detailed and coherent, and based on who they needed me to be, rather than who I actually was. The plan involved a career in corporate law, a house in a good neighborhood, and a husband from a Nigerian family they approved of. Ideally someone whose parents they already knew, whose background could be verified through the informal network that immigrant families maintain for exactly this purpose. I understood the plan. I had been aware of it for years. What I had not told them, not directly, not in the way that would have forced a conversation, was that I had a different plan. And the man at the centre of my different plan was named Daniel. Daniel Reeves was a public defender in Atlanta. I met him at a civil rights conference during my second year of law school. He was presenting on wrongful conviction cases in Georgia, and he spoke with the kind of clarity and passion that I recognized immediately as the mark of a person who was doing exactly the work they were built to do. He was also, for the record, deeply handsome, which I mention not because it is the point, but because leaving it out would be dishonest, and I am trying to tell the truth. We talked for 3 hours after his presentation. We exchanged numbers. We spent the next 6 months in a long-distance relationship between New Haven and Atlanta that consisted of phone calls, weekend visits, and the gradual, irreversible process of 2 people deciding that their lives make more sense together than apart. Daniel was black. Daniel was not Nigerian. Daniel did not have parents my parents knew. Daniel was a public defender, which in the framework my parents used to evaluate professional achievement, sat at approximately the opposite end of the spectrum from corporate law at a major firm. None of these things were the reason I loved him, but all of them were the reason my family struggled with him, and that struggle, which I watched build quietly over the year I dated him, before telling my parents how serious it was, became the crisis that reorganized my entire life. The conversation in my parents' living room happened on a Sunday in December, 6 months before I was supposed to graduate from law school. I had driven from New Haven to Houston for what my mother had described as a family visit, and which turned out to be something more formal than that. My father and mother at one end of the living room, my grandmother on the phone from Lagos on speaker, and my 2 brothers in their chairs, wearing the expressions of men who had been briefed in advance and had agreed to be present as witnesses rather than participants. My father spoke first. He was measured and careful, and clearly had thought about what he was going to say, which was both respectful and devastating, because a father who has prepared his argument has usually decided in advance that the argument is going to win. He told me that he and my mother had concerns about Daniel. He listed the concerns methodically, the different background, the public defender salary, the fact that Daniel was not someone they knew, the fact that he was not Nigerian, and finally, the thing he said last because he had saved it as the weight that would settle the question, the fact that my mother had spoken to her friend, whose daughter had married outside the Nigerian community, and how much difficulty that had caused, and how she did not want to see that difficulty in my life. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt, because interrupting would have been disrespectful, and because I wanted to hear the whole case before I responded. When my father finished, my mother spoke briefly, and said essentially the same things with more emotion. Then my grandmother added from the phone something about the importance of shared culture that I will not reproduce in full because it was said from love, even if it landed as something else. And when they were all finished, I sat with it for a moment. Then I said plainly and without drama that I loved Daniel, that I intended to continue the relationship, and that I hoped they would come to know him the way I knew him. Then my father told me that if I left that room and continued, I was doing it without the family's support. I said I understood. I drove back to New Haven the next morning. The years immediately after that conversation are the ones I find hardest to describe accurately, because they contained things that were terrible and things that were beautiful, and the two categories were not separate. They were woven into each other in the way that life actually is, which is messier and more honest than the version most people tell. Daniel and I moved to Atlanta when I graduated. I took a job at a legal aid organisation, which was the work I had always wanted to do, and which paid significantly less than the corporate path my parents had mapped, and which felt, every single morning I walked through the door, like the right place for the skills I had spent 3 years of law school developing. Daniel and I shared a small apartment in Decatur. We were happy in the particular way that people are happy when they have chosen something difficult and right at the same time, which is a specific kind of happiness that does not look like the easy kind, but is more sustaining. My family's communication with me during this period was minimal. My mother sent texts on birthdays and holidays. My father called twice a year, brief calls about practical matters. Was I doing okay? Was I staying healthy? Did I need anything? The calls were not warm and were not cold. They existed in the register of maintenance, the way you maintain a connection you are not willing to fully sever, but are not currently able to fully inhabit. My brothers called more often, separately, and our conversations had the quality of people navigating around a subject that occupied the centre of the room. Daniel was never mentioned by my family. I mentioned him occasionally. The mentions were received in silence. Daniel died on a Thursday morning in April, 4 years into our life in Atlanta. He was 34 years old. He had an undiagnosed heart condition, a structural defect in one of his valves that had gone undetected through every physical he had ever had, and that expressed itself, suddenly and completely, and without any warning, while he was running in Piedmont Park at 7 in the morning. A woman walking her dog called 911. The paramedics arrived in 4 minutes, which is fast, and which was not fast enough. He was pronounced at the hospital at 8:14. I was in my office reviewing case files when my phone rang. I will not describe what that phone call was like, because it belongs to me and to his family, and to the private terrain of grief that does not improve from being narrated. What I will tell you is that in the days that followed, my parents came. They did not call to ask if they should come. My mother simply appeared at the door of the apartment I had shared with Daniel, and held me. And my father sat in the living room and said nothing for a long time, and the silence was more true than anything words could have been. They stayed for 5 days. They helped me make the calls and write the notices, and navigate the paperwork that death requires of the living. And in those 5 days, without the subject ever being directly addressed, something changed in my family's understanding of what Daniel had been to me, and what losing him meant. Grief has a way of burning through the things that are not real. My parents had spent 4 years unable to see Daniel clearly, because they were looking through a frame they had built from fear and unfamiliarity. They saw him clearly for the first time at his funeral, in the testimonies of the clients whose lives he had changed, in the colleagues who spoke about the quality of his work, in the people who had loved him, and whose love for him was self-evidently real and earned. My father cried at the funeral. I had never seen my father cry before. I have not seen it since. The year after Daniel died was the year I stopped. Not permanently. not in the dramatic way of a person who has given up, but in the necessary way of a person who has been moving fast for a long time and needs to find out who she is when she is standing still. I went to work every day. I handled my caseload. I met with clients and filed motions and appeared in court and did the work with the same attention I had always given it, because the work was the one thing that still made sense, and I was not willing to let grief take it from me. Outside the office, I did very little. I did not date. I did not make new friends, though I allowed my existing friends to be present with me in the way good friends are present, without pressure, without timeline, without the expectation that grief proceeds in any particular direction at any particular speed. I read a great deal. I cooked for myself in the small kitchen of the apartment I had decided to stay in, because leaving felt like an erasure, and I was not ready for erasure. And I thought, carefully, slowly, the way you think when you have been forced to stop, and you discover that stopping creates space you did not know you were missing. I thought about what I was building with my legal aid work, and whether the structure of it made sense, and whether I was working in the most effective way I could. I thought about my clients, the families navigating eviction proceedings, the workers facing wage theft, the immigrants dealing with documentation issues, and I thought about what they needed that they were not getting, and whether there was something more comprehensive I could create. And I thought about Daniel, who had spent his career believing that everyone deserved a competent advocate, regardless of what they could pay. And I thought about how to honour that belief with my own work for the rest of my working life. The non-profit started from a conversation, which is how most things worth doing start. I was having lunch with a colleague named Priya, who ran a tenant rights clinic downtown, and she was describing the gap between the number of people who needed legal help and the capacity of the organisations available to provide it. And she said something I wrote on a napkin and still have. She said the problem is not that there are not enough good lawyers who want to do this work. The problem is that the infrastructure for connecting them to the people who need them does not exist at the scale the need requires. I looked at the napkin. Then I looked at Priya. Then I said I thought I might know how to build that infrastructure, and that if I was going to try, I was going to need her to tell me everything she knew about the gap between supply and demand in legal aid services in Atlanta and the surrounding counties. She told me everything she knew over the following 3 hours, and I took 12 pages of notes. And I drove home that evening and opened a new document on my laptop and typed at the top of it, in the way you name something when you are not sure yet if it is going to exist, but you want to give it a shape to grow into, Maya's thing. I changed the name later. The name I changed it to was the Daniel Reeves Legal Aid Foundation, because naming it after him was the most honest description I had of what it was and why I was building it, and because he deserved to have something real in the world with his name on it. Building the non-profit in the first year was the hardest professional work I had ever done, which is a significant statement given that I had spent 3 years in law school and 4 years doing legal aid work in an underfunded organisation. The difficulty was not the legal structure. I knew how to file for non-profit status, and I had colleagues who could help me navigate the specifics. The difficulty was the combination of things that go into building an institution from nothing: the fundraising, which requires you to ask people for money in the service of a vision that does not yet have proof of concept; the hiring, which requires you to evaluate other people's capabilities and trustworthiness under conditions of significant uncertainty; the governance, which requires you to build a board of directors that has real expertise and real commitment, and not just the names of people who agreed to have their names on a letterhead; and the operational design, which requires you to figure out in advance exactly how the thing is going to work well enough that you can explain it to funders and staff and clients before it has actually worked. I did all of this while managing my grief, which did not stop on any schedule I controlled, and while maintaining my relationship with my family, which had entered a new and tentative phase after Daniel's death, and which required energy I did not always have to spare. I am not going to tell you it was easy, because it was not easy, and anyone who tells you that building something meaningful is easy is either telling you a compressed version of a longer story or has confused the highlights with the whole of it. The first grant we received was from a foundation in Atlanta that funds legal services organizations, and it was small enough that I could have dismissed it as insufficient and large enough that I did not. $25,000 for a pilot program serving eviction defense clients in 2 zip codes on the south side of the city. I hired 1 staff attorney, a recent graduate named James who had the qualities I had learned to look for: genuine commitment, real curiosity, willingness to do the unglamorous parts of the work without complaint. We set up in borrowed office space. We took on 43 clients in the first 4 months. We won 31 cases. The wins were documented. The documentation became the evidence base for the next grant application. The next grant was larger. Then the next. By the end of year 2, we had 4 staff attorneys, a paralegal, a grant writer named Susan who was worth more than her salary, and a caseload that had served just over 800 clients. By year 4, we had moved into our own space, grown to 11 staff members, and expanded to serve clients across 5 counties. By year 6, which is where I am now, we have 23 staff members. We have served over 12,000 clients. We have a board of directors that includes some of the most respected legal and civic minds in Atlanta, and we have a waiting list that tells me the work is not finished and will not be finished in my lifetime, and that this is not a source of discouragement, but of purpose. My relationship with my parents rebuilt itself slowly and imperfectly, the way real things rebuild rather than the way stories describe rebuilding. It did not happen in a single conversation or a single moment of recognition. It happened in the accumulation of smaller things. My mother calling more regularly and asking about the work with genuine curiosity rather than polite tolerance. My father attending our first annual benefit. Dinner and sitting in the audience while I spoke and listening with the attention of a man who was finally able to see the thing I had, built clearly enough to understand it. It happened in my brothers visiting Atlanta and coming to the office and meeting my staff and understanding, maybe for the first time, what I had been doing and why it mattered. And it happened, most significantly, in a conversation my father and I had about 3 years after Daniel died, in the kitchen of my parents' house in Houston during a Christmas visit, when my mother had gone to bed, and it was just the 2 of us at the kitchen table with tea, in the way we used to sit when I was young, and he was helping me with something I could not figure out on my own. He asked me if I had forgiven him. I told him there was not much to forgive, that I understood where he had come from, and why he had made the decisions he had made, and that the cost of those decisions had been paid mostly by me, but had been felt by all of us, and that I thought the most useful thing we could do was stop accounting for the past and put our attention on what was in front of us. He said that was generous of me. I told him it was practical, which is the same thing in my experience. I want to tell you about a client named Marcus, because Marcus is the reason I keep going on the days when the operational demands of running an organisation make it difficult to remember what the organisation is for. Marcus was 44 years old when he came to us, a machinist who had worked for the same manufacturing company for 17 years. He had been fired under circumstances that his employer described as a performance issue, and that, when our attorney James examined the timeline, bore a suspicious resemblance to the week Marcus had filed a workers' compensation claim for a repetitive stress injury to his right shoulder. Marcus could not afford a private employment attorney. He had tried to navigate the complaint process on his own and had made procedural errors that had weakened his case significantly by the time he reached us. James spent 3 months on Marcus's case, rebuilding the procedural record where it could be rebuilt, gathering the evidence that the employer had made no performance documentation before the firing, demonstrating the temporal relationship between the workers' compensation filing and the termination date. We settled with the employer for an amount I will not disclose because the settlement agreement required confidentiality, but which was sufficient to give Marcus time to retrain and find new employment without the financial pressure that had been crushing him since he was fired. Marcus sent us a card afterward. He wrote in it, in the handwriting of a man who does not write cards often because he is not used to having things to celebrate, that he had not believed anyone was going to help him, and that we had. I keep that card in my desk drawer. I read it on the days that are hard. There are many days that are hard. The card helps. The question I get asked most often, by funders and journalists and people at the benefit dinners who are curious about the organisation's origin, is why I named it after Daniel. The question is usually asked with a delicacy that tells me the questioner is not sure whether asking it is appropriate, which it is, because the answer to it is the most important thing I can say about what the foundation is and why it exists. I named it after Daniel because Daniel taught me the thing that all the law school classes and legal aid work and professional development and organisational strategy I had absorbed over 15 years of legal career had not quite taught me. And the thing he taught me was this: every person who comes through a courtroom door carries a full life with them. They carry their history and their family and their fear and their hope and the specific combination of circumstances that brought them to this particular moment in this particular place. And the quality of justice they receive is not determined only by the law and not only by the facts, but also by whether the person representing them sees that full life and acts accordingly. Daniel saw the full lives of his clients. He saw them as human beings first and defendants second, and that order of seeing made him a better lawyer and a more effective advocate than most of the people who went to better law schools and took higher-paying jobs. I named the foundation after him because I want every person who works here to understand that the name on the door is a description of how we do the work, not just who the work is for. My grandmother in Lagos died in the 5th year of the foundation's operation. She was 89 years old. I had visited her once after Daniel's death, a trip to Lagos that my mother had organised and that I had taken because I understood, for the first time with real clarity, that the time remaining for those visits was finite. She held my hands and asked about the work. She had been following the foundation's development through my mother and through her own methods. She had someone in Lagos who printed things from the internet for her, because she was 89 and had never learned to use a computer, but had not let that stop her from staying informed. She said she thought what I was doing was good work. She said it in Igbo, which I speak imperfectly, and then she translated it into English, which she spoke very well, with the slight formality of a person who learned a language as an adult. She said, "This work is the kind your father's people came here to make possible, the kind that gives what was not given." I have thought about that sentence many times since. The kind that gives what was not given. She meant, I think, that the foundation was in some way a continuation of what my parents had done when they had sacrificed to come to a new country and build something, that the work I was doing with people who had been denied access to something they needed was the same impulse, expressed in a different form. I am not sure I fully agree with that reading, but I am not sure I fully disagree with it either. My grandmother was a smart woman. She spent a lot of time thinking about things, and not much time saying things that were not worth thinking about. I tend to give her the benefit of the doubt. The benefit dinner in Year 5 was the evening I want to tell you about specifically, because it was the evening that brought together the different strands of this story in a way I had not planned or anticipated. My parents were there. My brothers were there, both of them, with their wives. Priya was there. James was there with his partner. The board members were there. About 250 people total, in a hotel ballroom in Midtown Atlanta, a fundraising event that would raise enough to fund the following year's expansion into a 6th county. The evening had the quality that benefit dinners have when they are going well, which is the quality of people who believe in something gathering to say so, and finding that the act of gathering makes the belief more real. I gave a speech. I will not reproduce the whole speech, because it was 20 minutes long and you have not signed up for that, but I want to tell you about the part that mattered. The part that mattered was when I talked about Daniel. I talked about him the way I always talk about him, when I talk about him publicly, with precision and love and without sentimentality, because sentimentality would be a disservice to someone who was precise and loving and completely unsentimental. I described the day I met him. I described what he believed about his work and why he believed it. I described what it looked like to watch a person be fully aligned between who they were and what they did, and how that alignment was the thing I had tried to build into the foundation's culture. And then I looked out at the audience, because I was near the end of the speech, and what came next was what I had been building to, and I found my father's face in the 2nd row. He was looking at me the way he had looked at me at Daniel's funeral, with the expression of a man who is seeing something clearly for the first time and finding that clarity both harder and better than he had expected. I said Daniel's name one more time. I said I built this for him, and because of him, and in the hope that the people who came through our doors would receive the same quality of attention he had given his clients. Then I said thank you and sat down. The room applauded. My father stood up first. What happened after my father stood up is something I want to describe carefully, because it is easy to misread and I want to get it right. He did not stand up dramatically or immediately, or in a way that drew attention to himself. He stood up the way a man stands up when he has decided something and is expressing the decision through action rather than words, which is consistent with who my father is and has always been. The person next to him stood up, and then the row behind him, and within 30 seconds most of the room was standing. Standing ovations at benefit dinners are not unusual, and they should not be overinterpreted as expressions of personal sentiment toward the speaker. But I was watching my father's face, and what I saw there was not the general enthusiasm of a crowd moved by a speech. It was something specific and private and real, the expression of a man who had spent 8 years at a certain distance from his oldest daughter, and had just, in the space of a 20-minute speech in a hotel ballroom, understood the full distance of what he had been standing away from. He did not hug me in the ballroom. He found me at the end of the evening, when most of the guests had left and the staff was breaking down the tables. He stood in front of me and he said, and I want to be precise about this because the words matter, he said, "I am proud of you, Maya. I have always been proud of you, and I have not always shown it well, and I am sorry for that." I told him I appreciated it. I told him I loved him, and then we stood together for a moment in the emptying ballroom, and the moment was real, imperfect, earned, and enough. I want to talk about loneliness, because nobody tells you about the loneliness of building something, and not telling people about it is a form of dishonesty that I object to professionally. The loneliness is not the loneliness of isolation. I have colleagues and friends and a family that has found its way back to me and the daily company of 23 people who work alongside me. The loneliness is the loneliness that comes from being the person who is responsible for the vision, which means being the person who holds the vision when nobody else can see it yet, and who carries the weight of that visibility alone. In the first year, when we had $25,000 and one staff attorney and borrowed office space and no proof that what we were building would hold, I was the only person who was certain enough to keep going. And certainty is a lonely place when it is based on something internal rather than something demonstrated. I have talked to other non-profit founders and to entrepreneurs and to people who have built things from nothing in various sectors, and they all describe some version of the same loneliness. The loneliness does not go away when the thing succeeds. It changes character. In the beginning, it is the loneliness of uncertainty. Later, it is the loneliness of responsibility, which is the knowledge that 23 people and 12,000 clients and the work itself are counting on the decisions you make, and that the decisions are ultimately yours to make, and that the weight of them is not transferable. I do not say this to complain. I say it because I think the people who are in the middle of building something deserve to know that the loneliness is real and normal, and is not evidence that anything is wrong. It is evidence that you are doing something real, and real things are built by people who are willing to be alone with the vision long enough for the vision to become true. There is a question I have been asked several times by journalists, and once by a graduate student who was writing a paper on legal aid organisations, and the question is whether I think I would have built the foundation if Daniel had not died. It is the kind of question that invites a particular kind of answer, the answer where loss becomes the seed of creation, where tragedy is redeemed by what grows from it. I understand why people ask it, and I understand the desire for that answer, because it offers a frame in which grief is legible and purposeful rather than simply enormous and irreversible. My honest answer is that I do not know. I think I was going to build something, because building is the thing I am constitutionally oriented toward, and the legal aid work was always going to lead me somewhere. Whether it would have been this thing with this name, with this specific purpose and this specific culture, I cannot know that. What I know is that losing Daniel made certain things clear that had not been clear before. It made clear that the work we do is urgent in a way that comfortable lives obscure. It made clear that the people who need legal help do not have the luxury of waiting for an institution to slowly find its footing, and that urgency became part of the Foundation's operational philosophy in ways I think are visible to anyone who watches how we work. And it made clear that the thing I was building needed to be real and not symbolic, needed to serve actual people with actual legal problems and not just represent a value, because Daniel had never confused representing a value with actually doing the work, and I was not going to start. I want to tell you about a day in the 3rd year that I have never spoken about publicly, because it is the closest I have come to stopping, and I think honesty about those moments is more useful to people who are building things than the version of success stories that skips over them. We had received a grant that was larger than any we had received before, from a national foundation that funds legal services organisations, and the grant had come with reporting requirements and an evaluation process, and the expectation that we could demonstrate impact at a scale we had not yet fully achieved. We were also in the middle of a lease negotiation for our own office space, our first real space, and the negotiation had gone sideways in a way that threatened to delay our move by months. And one of our staff attorneys, a woman named Christine, who was one of the best lawyers I had ever worked with, told me she was leaving to take a position at a large firm because she had significant student loan debt and could not stay at our salary level any longer. All of this happened in the same week. On Friday evening, I sat in the borrowed office after everyone had left, and I looked at the caseload spreadsheet and the grant reporting requirements and the lease negotiation document, and I thought for the first time with real force about what it would mean to close the organisation, not to walk away from the cause. I was not going to walk away from the cause, but to admit that the particular thing I was trying to build was beyond what I could sustain. I sat with that thought for about 45 minutes. Then I called Priya, who answered even though it was Friday evening, because good colleagues answer on Friday evenings. And she listened to the whole thing, and then she said something that is in the same category as the napkin from lunch and the card from Marcus. She said, "Maya, you are describing a hard week. You are not describing a thing that cannot be built. There is a difference." I went home and slept for 9 hours and came back on Monday and addressed the grant reporting, and found a replacement attorney who turned out to be excellent, and closed the lease negotiation on acceptable terms. The week that had felt like an ending was just a week. My mother came to Atlanta for a week last spring, not for an event, not for a specific occasion. She came because she wanted to spend time and said so directly, which is a new quality in our relationship that I attribute to the accumulation of years and grief and the rebuilding that followed. She came to the office. She sat in the waiting room and watched clients arrive and depart. She sat in on a team meeting with the team's permission and watched how we work and listened to the case discussions and the operational conversations. On the last day of her visit, we walked in Piedmont Park, in the same park where Daniel had died, which is a place I return to regularly because he loved it, and because avoiding it seemed like a way of letting the place belong to the loss rather than to the person. My mother held my hand while we walked, which is something she had done when I was a child, and had not done since I was grown. We did not talk much. When we got to the spot near the lake, where Daniel and I used to sit on weekend mornings, I stopped and she stopped with me, and we stood there for a few minutes, and then she said his name. Not in the context of a sentence, not as the beginning of something, just his name, as an acknowledgement, as a way of making him present in the place where he had last been alive. It was the first time my mother had said his name unprompted in the 8 years since I had told my family about him. I did not say anything. I squeezed her hand. We walked back out of the park in the spring light, and I drove her to the airport, and she hugged me for a long time before she went through security. The hug was the whole conversation. I have thought a great deal, over the 8 years since I walked out of my parents' living room, about the nature of family loyalty and what it actually requires of the people inside a family. The version of loyalty my parents held when I was 29 was a version that required conformity. Loyalty meant following the plan, accepting the framework, choosing within the approved options. I understand where that version came from. It came from people who had survived by holding together, by making decisions collectively, by trusting the community's accumulated wisdom about what was safe and what was dangerous. For immigrants who had built something from nothing in a country that was not theirs by birth, collective conformity had been a survival strategy, and survival strategies get encoded as values by the people who use them to survive. But a survival strategy from one generation, applied without modification to the next, becomes a constraint rather than a protection. The thing I needed my family to give me when I was 29 was not conformity. It was the permission to be wrong on my own terms. I did not need them to believe in Daniel. I needed them to believe in me enough to let me make my own mistakes and find my own way. They were not able to do that then. They are more able to do it now. The change did not happen because I demanded it. It happened because the years accumulated and the evidence accumulated, and eventually the story my family had been telling about me became too small to contain the actual facts of my life. The staff meeting, where I announced our 12,000th client, was not a celebration in the formal sense. We do not do much formal celebration at the foundation, not because celebration is unimportant, but because the client is always more important than the milestone. And stopping to celebrate milestones can, if you are not careful, become a way of congratulating yourself on numbers, rather than doing the work that produces them. What I said at the meeting was brief. I said that 12,000 clients meant 12,000 people who had received legal representation they could not otherwise have accessed, and that 12,000 was a meaningful number, not because of what it represented about us, but because of what it had meant to each of those individuals in the specific moment when they needed help and received it. Then I said we had work to do and we got back to it. James, who has been with me since the beginning and who knows me well enough to understand what I do not say, as well as what I do, sent me a text later that afternoon. It said simply, "Daniel would have liked this." I kept that text. It sits in a folder on my phone alongside the photograph of Daniel that I look at when I need to remember clearly. He is standing at a podium at a public defender conference, mid-sentence, mid-argument, in the posture of a man who is completely certain that what he is saying matters, and who is going to make sure everyone in the room understands why. He looks like someone who has figured out exactly what his life is for. I hope I look like that sometimes. I am still working on it. I want to address the question of romantic relationships, because it is the question people most often circle around without quite asking, and I would rather address it directly than leave a space that gets filled with speculation. I have not been in a serious relationship since Daniel. I am not ruling it out. I am 38 years old and I have a long life ahead of me. And I do not think loving Daniel means I cannot love someone else. Because love is not a finite resource, and Daniel himself would have been the first to tell me that. But I am also not in a hurry, and I have learned over the last 8 years that one of the things grief does, when you do not rush through it, is clarify your understanding of what actually matters to you, and what you will not compromise on. The clarity is useful in every part of life, not just in romance. It is useful in hiring decisions and board recruitment and grant strategy, and the daily choices about how to spend the limited time and energy available for building something real. I know what I am building. I know what I care about. I know what Daniel cared about, and I carry that knowledge into every decision I make about the foundation. Whether I find someone to share my life with in addition to the work, that is a question I leave open without anxiety, which is the best relationship with uncertainty I have managed to develop. I am a work in progress. The foundation is a work in progress. Both of these things are fine. There is something I have been saying to the law students who come to visit the foundation through a clinical program partnership we have with 2 local law schools. Something I started saying because it was true and have continued saying because I have watched it be useful to the people who heard it. The thing I say is this: you are going to meet people who will tell you that the work you want to do is not viable, not sustainable, not realistic, not the best use of your abilities. Some of those people will be strangers, and their opinions will be easy to set aside. Some of them will be people you love and respect, and their opinions will be considerably harder to set aside. What I want you to understand is that the people who tell you something cannot be done are always speaking from their own experience of what they have seen done. They are not speaking from knowledge of your specific capacity and your specific commitment and your specific vision. They do not know what you are going to do because you have not done it yet. The only evidence that matters about whether something can be done is the evidence you generate by attempting it. And the only way to generate that evidence is to start, which requires you to begin before you have proof, which requires a kind of courage that looks from the outside a great deal like stubbornness. It is both. I am both. I started without proof. I built the proof by building the thing, and the thing is here, and it has served 12,000 people, and none of those 12,000 people care whether the thing was supposed to be possible. They only know that when they needed help, someone was there. Last Sunday I sat in my small house in Atlanta and called my mother the way we call each other now. On Sunday evenings, long calls, real conversations. She asked about a case we had been working on, a complicated immigration matter that had been in the news locally, and she asked smart questions, the kind of questions that tell you someone has been paying attention. At the end of the call, she asked me if I was happy. It is a question she has started asking in the last year or two, where before she would have asked whether I was okay or whether I was managing, which are different questions that expect different answers. Happy is a bigger question and requires a more honest answer. I told her that I was not happy in the continuous, uninterrupted way that the word sometimes implies, because I do not think that kind of happiness is available to people who are paying attention to the world. And paying attention to the world is not something I am willing to stop doing. But I told her I was satisfied in a deep way, the kind that comes from working on something real and knowing it is real, and from having a life that is structured around things I actually believe in, and from having people in it, my staff, my clients, my board, my friends and my family, slowly and imperfectly rebuilt, who were there because they chose to be, and not because they had no choice. I told her I thought Daniel would have said something similar about his own life, had he had more of it. She was quiet for a moment after I said that, the way she is quiet now when his name comes up, which is a different kind of quiet than the avoidance that used to be there. It is the quiet of someone sitting with something real rather than away from it. Then she said she was glad. I said I was glad too. We said good night. I put down the phone and sat with the quiet of the house and the late light through the kitchen window and the knowledge, which I carry every day and do not take for granted, that the life I built is the life I chose, and that choosing it cost something, and that cost was worth every cent of what it took. I am 38 years old. I am still building. And I intend to build for a very long time.